Top U.S. lawmakers continue to argue over the country's debt ceiling as the deadline for a deal is approaching fast. Just how far apart are they? And what would it mean if the world's biggest economy defaults on its debt? This is Inside Story. Hello, a warm welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Seeker. Republicans and Democrats continue to debate the U.S. debt ceiling as the August 2nd deadline approaches. If no solution is found, the government will run out of money needed to pay its debt. Economists and politicians are warning that could have a disastrous effect. And time is running out for the president and lawmakers in Congress to come up with a plan they can all agree on. John Terrett has more.
Top U.S. politicians might be keeping a low profile this weekend, but their deputies have been out in force on the Sunday broadcast, urging action on the U.S. debt crisis.
I think that all the leaders of Congress and the president have acknowledged that we must raise the debt limit, and the question is how.
At issue, will the U.S. be able to pay all its bills on August the 2nd, the deadline for the Congress to raise the debt ceiling beyond its present $14.3 trillion?
The country will not default. Whether or not there are savings achieved in the process remains open to question.
Republicans refuse to raise taxes and the Democrats don't want cuts in social programs. But with time ebbing away, two plans have recently come to the fore. A proposal by Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell would empower President Obama to raise the debt ceiling in increments over the next year, and it also gives Republicans the chance to vote their disapproval.
Who knows if there's a combination of R's and D's who'll go for it, but I'm telling you, House conservative members, members of the Republican side, they're not going to support the McConnell plan. I'm not going to support the McConnell plan. As Chris rightly points out, this is just kicking the can down the road, and that's...
He's referring to a possible Republican move to vote in the House this week to raise the debt ceiling by over $2 trillion and cut spending by a similar amount. Cut, cap and balance, they call it, as it also requires a constitutional amendment forcing the federal government to balance its budget just like the 50 states have to.
I mean, what's wrong with letting the states decide whether we should have a balance? 49 out of 50 states have it.
The reality
every
is
municipality,
they don't have
every township government, every city government, every family, every business.
What you guys
Tell me what's wrong.
And you know it.
That level of back and forth is likely to continue down to the wire on August the 2nd. Both sides aware that a presidential election 16 months away means this is no time to be blamed for prolonging U.S. economic woes. John Terrett, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Well, let's take a closer look at America's credit. Currently, the Federal Reserve, that's the U.S. central bank, is borrowing more than 5 times the rate of GDP growth. So what does this mean in figures? Well, while the U.S. economy only grows by $1 billion a day, it borrows $5.5 billion. This is known as the debt trajectory. And translated, this means 43 cents of every dollar the U.S. spends is borrowed. The deadline for action is in 2 weeks, when the Treasury will owe $29 billion in interest, but will already have missed $54 billion in scheduled payments if the debt ceiling hasn't been extended. Well, for more on this, we're joined by our guests. Joining us via broadband from Fredericksburg, Virginia, Jason Johnson, Professor of Political Science at Hiram College. He recently authored a book called Political Consultants and Campaigns, One Day to Sell. From Singapore, David Cohen joins us. He's Director of Asian Economic Forecasting for Action Economics, an independent market analysis firm. Mr. Cohen was also previously an economist at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors in Washington. Gentlemen, thanks for being with us. David Cohen, if I could start with you. Before we get into the rights and wrongs of all this and the politics behind it all, let's just fast forward 2 weeks and look at worst case scenarios here. We get to August 2nd and there is no agreement on raising this U.S. debt ceiling. What happens next? Will the U.S. really default on its debt? Because that would be unprecedented.
That could... well, provoke a financial crisis. Presumably, the Treasury Secretary would still try to do something to prevent the default on the maturing obligations. But by that point, if they've technically failed to meet the deadline, the market could already be bailing from Treasuries, which could trigger a financial crisis.
Jason Johnson, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think eventually someone will bite the bullet at some point in the next 2 weeks, or will we get to this catastrophic scenario as many people are predicting?
Barack Obama's going to have to cave because right now you've got a situation where everyone in Congress thinks they can get a better deal in 18 months. The Republicans think in 18 months they might win the White House, which means that they'll get all the budget cuts that they want. Barack Obama thinks he's going to get reelected, which means he thinks he's going to have more Democrats in the House to help him. But right now, he's responsible for the economy, and I think he's going to go along with the Republican plan. He's got no choice.
David Cohen, do you think, I mean, if we were to get to a default scenario, do you believe that that would happen for the U.S.?
I think they'll avoid a default. There's going to be a lot of political theater for the next week and probably some frayed nerves in the financial markets. But before the deadline, the broad expectation is that the U.S. will pass the necessary legislation to avoid default and the potential financial crisis that might trigger.
You think just to get into the politics of this a little bit with you, David Cohen, you think that the Republicans are playing hardball here and sticking basically to their ideology above all else? Do you think many of them are prepared to let the chips fall where they may as far as the debt ceiling, basically on a principle of not wanting to raise taxes?
There's a lot of posturing and a poker game going on right now, but I think they understand that it would not be a politically winning solution, a position for them to be blamed for triggering a financial crisis. So I think what the Republican leadership has put forward is a compromise that they would allow the debt ceiling to be raised and they could still express their disapproval, and I think that's a likely scenario.
Jason Johnson, if Obama does cave in here, as you mentioned earlier, what implications is this likely going to have for him going into 2012?
It's going to hurt him. If he caves, it's going to hurt him because the Republicans, it works to their advantage for the U.S. economy to be bad. And when the president doesn't appear that he can negotiate from strength with his own lower house, it's going to affect our markets. It's going to affect the economy. So even if the debt ceiling is raised, if it's raised the way the Republicans want to, and Obama appears weak in the process, it's going to harm his reelection chances. What he's probably going to do is cave, but what he needs to do is stick to his guns and see if he can get something from the Republicans that they don't want to give him.
But is there a danger here, Jason Johnson, that the Republicans could overplay their hand?
Definitely. The problem is that the American public is pretty short-sighted. For the most part, political scientists, we talk about this all the time. The president gets too much credit and too much blame. It's like a good striker in a football game. You know, he's going to get blamed if the debt ceiling isn't raised, even if it's the Republicans' fault. He will be blamed for a poor economy, even if it's the Republicans' recalcitrance. So he's got to do something here. The Republicans probably can't overplay their hand.
David Cohen, what potential effect is this having on the markets beyond the United States? Europe is, of course, dealing with its own debt problems. And how do you think markets in Asia are going to respond where you are?
Well, so far the markets have been relatively calm. The U.S. Treasury yields remain at historically low levels, suggesting that few people have panicked yet. We'll see what happens as we approach the deadline, but I think there's still the sense that they can come up. The U.S. would be foolish to unnecessarily default. The world is more than willing to continue lending them the money, and it wouldn't help anyone to trigger a financial meltdown. You know, and the Republicans could still come up with a way to structure this that they could still hang to their principles and try to bring the size of the government as the issue in the campaign in 2012, but it wouldn't help their position to be seen as unnecessarily triggering a financial collapse.
Jason Johnson, I saw you nodding to some of that. I mean, this goes back to the point that we discussed earlier, that the Republicans don't want to be seen as the bad guys in all of this. They don't want to be seen as being mean-spirited if it really starts to hurt people's pockets in the U.S.
Here's the catch. Last year during the midterm elections, Barack Obama defined the Republicans as the party of no. They've done everything in their power to refuse any sort of plans. They fought against his stimulus. They fought against his health care reform. But at the end of the day, the American public still ends up blaming the president for problems happening. If you look at the poll numbers right now, Americans hold Congress in low self-esteem. Their approval rating's about 20%, and Republicans are approved of less than Democrats. But in the end, eventually the chips fall into the lap of the president of the United States, and he's got to find a way to not only raise this debt ceiling, but raise it in a way that doesn't make him appear weak. And again, the Republicans don't have to worry. They don't control the White House right now, but they think they will if they can pull this off.
But there are precedents for this, aren't there? I mean, there are many occasions when the U.S. has had to raise the debt ceiling in the past with the agreement of Democrats and Republicans, and we haven't had anything like this sort of partisan back and forth here. Why do you think that is? Is it because perhaps the political discourse that we're in at the moment is much more partisan, is much more mean-spirited, perhaps?
Yeah, we've got this wonderful cocktail of an extended recession, a very angry conservative Republican Party, hostility at the base of the Republican Party of having an African-American president. There are lots of things here that have sort of justified and fueled this Republican intransigence throughout much of these debates. So, you know, it's a perfect storm in a negative way for the U.S. economy. And again, they don't appear to be backing up because it hasn't hurt them so far.
Well, you talk about this intransigence. Isn't there intransigence as well on the Democrat side? I mean, aren't they going to have to get realistic about some of their cherished social programs and basically make deeper cuts for the sake of the country's long-term fiscal health?
Here's the catch. Even if you make massive cuts in Medicare, even if you make massive cuts in student loans, that's not the majority of how the U.S. is spending its money. We spend our money primarily on our wars in Iraq, and really, in many respects, it is the George Bush tax cuts, which are almost 10 years old now, that have really led to a lot of the economic difficulties that we're dealing with. One of the things that Obama wants to do is raise taxes back to the rates that they were during the Clinton administration. That would help fund the U.S. government and prevent some of these cuts, but the Republicans don't want to do it. They're holding on with a tenacious grip to Bush's tax cuts. Obama's going to have to try and beat them somehow.
David Cohen, what about this idea of eliminating the debt ceiling entirely? Is that a realistic option? I mean, Moody's on Monday has been talking about this as an option, that we don't need a debt ceiling at all, and that would solve the whole problem.
They have a point. It is unnecessary, but it does seem unlikely that they would eliminate that right now. It would just make for less political theater, but the markets still have remained calm in the face of all of this. So far, it really hasn't had very serious repercussions. The U.S. Treasury yield is still at historically low levels. As we said, the international markets are still prepared to continue lending money to the U.S. The majority of international reserves by the major holders, including China and Japan and India and Korea, Taiwan, the oil-producing nations, all have over half of their international reserves in U.S. treasuries, and frankly, they're in no hurry to unload them as long as the U.S. would just avoid shooting themselves in the foot.
Do you think the global markets have priced a lot of this in? Do you think they're prepared for the worst here?
Frankly, they haven't priced it in because most people are pretty convinced that the U.S. has not defaulted before, and they'll come up with some arrangement to escape default. But I suspect as the deadline approaches, the nerves will become a little more frayed in the market. Some of these holders of U.S. treasuries will become more anxious as the deadline approaches.
Jason Johnson, I saw you agreeing with some of that. The anxiety is clearly there, but they will find a way around it.
Oh, yes. The debt ceiling is going to be raised. The question is how and who blinks first. I mean, this is a staring contest of catastrophic proportions. Again, I predict that Obama will blink first. If he can get the Republicans to blink first, it would be great. But it's interesting because even the business community, which is usually strongly allied with the Republican Party, they've been saying for weeks in anticipation of a nervous market that this is a dangerous game to play. But again, unfortunately, politics and economics aren't always rational in the United States.
Yeah, that's certainly true if you ask a lot of people. But I mean, how do you, as far as this is going to play over the next few months for the rest of the year, Jason Johnson, is this, as some people have called it, basically just kicking the can down the road if they do come up with some sort of a compromise?
If they come up with the McConnell Compromise plan, where it basically gets voted on every couple of months, I think that's one thing the president's not going to want to do, because that will mean that this fight defines the 2012 election. This is not something that we can have going on every 3 quarters. This is not something we can have going on every few months, because every Republican running for president right now will basically involve themselves in the process. And that's not something good for our economy or the sitting president.
David Cohen, do you think a lot of this debate about the debt ceiling in the United States is perhaps taking a lot of time away from some of the other urgent economic problems that are in the U.S. at the moment, like unemployment and all of those other things? Do you think too much hot air is being wasted here? Is basically what I'm asking.
Well, the big waste is that they haven't taken this opportunity to resolve some of the fundamental imbalances in the U.S. Fiscal situation. The fact is the current expenditure trajectory is unsustainable. And they need to reach some sort of compromise with cutting expenditures, perhaps accompanied by some revenue increases, as the Democrats would like. But the point is, it would make a lot more sense if they would just get on with the process and reach their deal, rather than just kicking the can down the road, as you say, and just putting it off until the next election.
Are U.S. politicians, I mean, I asked this question of Jason Johnson earlier, are U.S. politicians too wedded to ideology here? Is that the reason? Because the reason I ask as well is because we have examples of where European economies have been confronted with the same problem. If we take, for example, the UK, a Conservative government is raising taxes and cutting spending. Why can't the US government do the same?
That's a good question. I mean, perhaps part of the problem is that the world is prepared to continue lending them the money. So even if they just come up with this temporary fix proposed by Senator McConnell, which would only kick the can down the road for another few months, it would not require coming to grips with the more fundamental problems, and the Republicans might be content to just wait until the next election, and it would seem advantageous for the U.S. and global economy if the U.S. would just get it done now.
Jason Johnson, I mean, let's talk a little bit more about the public perception of all of this, while the politicians in Washington are still basically trading shots at each other. How are the American people likely to look at this when so many of them are still on the unemployment lines, or so many of them living paycheck to paycheck, and there are foreclosures on homes? I mean, the U.S. economy is really struggling to get out of this deep recession that it suffered in 2008. How are they likely to look at all of this?
Americans aren't happy. Most Americans don't care about the debt ceiling. They're more concerned about keeping a roof over their own heads. So much of these debates are purely driven by the ideological motives of the left and the ideological motives on the right. What's been interesting is U.S. unemployment had been going down since December. It went down December, January, February. But suddenly the Republicans decided that taking care of the debt was more important than sort of taking care of unemployment. And that's when we saw our unemployment numbers go back up. So the public is frustrated. They really just want this situation solved so that the president can get back to his job of improving the U.S. economy.
And do you think the president has failed in basically selling this to the American people, selling his side of this, basically? Because the argument that keeps being made is by himself and by his fellow Democrats is that the Republicans basically want to, they don't want to raise taxes for people making $250,000, but then they talk about the Social Security checks not being paid, the paychecks not going to active U.S. soldiers. I mean, that is a strong argument to a lot of people. Why can't he seem to be able to sell that?
Because I think the American public doesn't want to listen to anything other than they want a new job. That's all they care about at this particular point. And it's interesting, there's this meme in the US public of people saying, well, you know, if I ran my family expenses the way that the government runs their debts and expenses, it would never work. Well, the reality is that is how most Americans are running their family expenses. We don't save money. We live off credit. We have the kind of government that our own economic individual behavior, it mirrors it. But unfortunately, people don't want to hear that. They want the president to wave a magic wand, fix in 8 years worth of policies by George Bush in 3.5 years, and put everybody back to work. He's got to have pretty broad shoulders, and I don't know if he's going to be successful.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that point with David Cohen in just a moment. But first of all, David, I want to ask you, where does China fit into all of this in terms of their exposure to U.S. debt here? Is this something that they are going to be obviously watching very closely, but this is something they're also nervous about?
No doubt they're nervous. They hold over $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds, and that clearly leaves them exposed to a potential default. But being such a large holder, that it's impractical for them to start unloading it without triggering a panic in the markets. So they're pretty much hostage to this situation right now. I mean, longer term, I think the Chinese are looking to diversify a little more. But as you pointed out earlier, there just aren't that many other markets so deep where they could invest $1 trillion. I mean, after all, the people talk about the German Bunds as being safe and reliable AAA assets, but after all, they're denominated in euros, which isn't exactly the safest place right now.
And what about this, the point that Jason made earlier, that ordinary Americans themselves could be doing a lot more to get their own financial house in order? Is that part of the problem?
Well, the American household sector is still feeling the consequences of the bursting of the housing bubble a couple of years ago, and that's left a lot of people underwater with their mortgages, and that's a major source of the strain in the U.S. economy right now. But there's not much in the way of easy solutions to that. The Federal Reserve has already lowered interest rates to near zero, and they're not particularly attracted to the so-called quantitative easing package that they had recently implemented, and the point is there are no easy fixes. I mean, as far as the U.S. fiscal situation, there is going to have to be some combination of spending cuts and tax increases, and it would just suit the country well if the government politicians would get on with the decision process.
All right, let's just in the minute or so that we have left, let's just take a look at how this might play out. Jason Johnson, if I could just turn back to you on this for the final word. As we go into the 2012 election, if the U.S. economy continues to splutter in this way, if Republicans and Democrats can't seem to come up with a long-term agreement on this, where does that leave ordinary Americans, and how? I mean, who basically wins out here?
Here's what will happen. If unemployment is not somewhere below, or at least trending below 8.5 by next summer, there is almost no chance that Barack Obama is going to get reelected, regardless of who the Republican nominee happens to be. If unemployment is comfortably below 8.5, or we're trending in that direction, then he'll be successful, and the debt ceiling will be forgotten about. But if things continue to go poorly, this will be seen as the moment that Obama really lost the election.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Jason Johnson in Fredericksburg and David Cohen in Singapore, many thanks for your time. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. As always, we welcome your comments and suggestions. You can email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.